While the Indians wanted independence, Hindus and Muslims were divided over the form of the independent state. Jawaharlal Nehru was the leader of the Congress Party and wanted the whole British colony to become the nation of India. However, Ali Jinnah, the leader of the Muslim League, wanted to form a separate Muslim state he called Pakistan, which literally means the land of the pure. Mahatma Gandhi, a Hindu and the most influential person in India, was opposed to the division of India. The question of whether the colony should be divided was a question that faced both the Indians and the British. The Muslim League planned for a direct action day in August 1946 as a peaceful protest to push for an independent state. However, agitators convinced Muslims that the Hindus were planning to attack the protesters. In Calcutta, a Muslim mob attacked Hindus and massacred them in the street. Hindus responded by massacring the Muslims. In one day, more than 6,000 people were killed. Afterwards, Jinnah said, "We shall have India divided, or we shall have India destroyed." Gandhi recognized that this violence would drive the Indians to form separate states, which he opposed. At age 73, Gandhi walked barefoot through the troubled provinces, staying with both Hindus and Muslims, reminding them that as Indians, they were leaves of the same tree. While Gandhi had a tremendous moral and spiritual influence over the average Indians, after the violence, both Hindu and Muslim leaders recognized that independence meant division. In February 1947, the British government named Lord Louis Mountbatten to be the Viceroy of India, and that India would be granted independence by 1948. However, after arriving in India and witnessing the violence, Mountbatten decided to accelerate the move to independence and that the independence country should be declared on August 15, 1947. Mountbatten agreed that the division of the colony into India and Pakistan was the best solution, although he doubted whether Pakistan was a viable country. His motivation for rapid division of the India colony was to limit British commitment and blame for the inter-ethnic violence he knew was going to occur. While both Hindus and Muslims agreed to divide the country, it was an impossible task to cleanly divide the populations. In many places, the two populations were either evenly mixed or enclaves with one population were surrounded by the other population. In addition, the two Muslim-dominated parts of the country were on opposite sides of Hindu India. Essentially, Pakistan would have eastern and western halves, separated by India. Pakistan would exist as a divided country for 25 years, until eastern Pakistan declared its independence and became the country of Bangladesh. The formation of India and Pakistan not only divided a population, but also economic structures. Calcutta and East Bengal had developed jute industry, but the jute plantations were in East Bengal and the jute mills and port facilities were in Calcutta. Jute is a reed-like plant that is used to make twine and burlap. The economic disruption caused 1 million East Bengalis to cross the border to India after the partition. In the Punjab region of northern India, the most agriculturally fertile region of India, was where the violence was worse. In the Punjab, the religious conflict was a three-way struggle between the Hindus, the Muslims, and the Sikhs. The Sikhs were a religion that merges Muslim and Hindu ideas. The Sikhs wanted to establish their own independent state. Prior to the partition, the Punjab had a population of 1.2 million people, of which 500,000 were Hindu and 100,000 were Sikhs. After the violence of the partition and the flight of Hindu and Sikh refugees, the region had a combined Hindu and Sikh population of 1,000. The interreligious violence drove both Muslims and Hindus to flee their homes. In India, the Hindus and Sikhs slaughtered trainloads of Muslims fleeing to Pakistan. Across the border in Pakistan, Muslims killed trainloads of Hindus. It is estimated that the violence in the Punjab region created 10 million refugees and resulted in somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 dead. The military proved unable to stop the violence. When the violence spread to Calcutta, Gandhi went on a hunger strike that ended the violence in 5 days. As the population separated, the violence settled down. The India-Pakistan borders, called the Line of Actual Control, were established by the United Nations. During the violence of the partition, Gandhi preached that India should remain united and that it even should have a Muslim leader. Many radical Hindu nationalists began to consider Gandhi to be a traitor. On January 30th, 1948, Gandhi was assassinated by a Hindu nationalist. His death shocked India. More than 1 million mourners gathered at his cremation. After his death, Nehru described the loss of Gandhi by saying, "The light has gone out of our lives." Independent India is the most populous democracy in the world. This is an amazing feat considering the tremendous diversity of the country. India has 16 official languages, but more than 22 languages are spoken by more than 1 million people in the country. In addition, while this majority Hindu, more than 800 million, it also has 150 Muslims, making it the second largest Muslim population in the world after Indonesia. In building a democratic system, India modeled its government after both Britain and the United States. India has a parliamentary system in which a major party governs the national government, but it also has a federal system in which regional governments have significant power in ruling their areas, which allows the government to recognize the diverse ethnic and religious differences in India. After independence, Jawaharlal Nehru became the first prime minister. He maintained close relations with Britain, and India became a member of the British Commonwealth. However, he also wanted India to be non-aligned in the Cold War, so he maintained relations with the United States, but moved closer to the Soviet Union. The close relations between India and the Soviet Union had less to do with Cold War issues and more to do with conflicts within Asia. In 1965 and 1971, India fought border clashes with Pakistan. In 1962, India fought a short border war with China. A Soviet alliance counterbalanced the threat of India's two enemies, Pakistan and China. After gaining independence, India was faced with two problems: interreligious violence and poverty. However, the fact that it has remained a democracy, it is in fact the world's largest democracy, is a sign of the strength of the country. However, that democracy has often been dominated by Congress Party and family rule. For example, in 1965, when Nehru died, his daughter, Indira Gandhi, who is not related to Mahatma Gandhi, became Prime Minister of India. In 1975, she declared a state of emergency because of economic and political problems. While this might have preserved Indian democracy in the long run, it did result in political opponents being jailed and restrictions on the press. Indira ruled India, with the exception of a 3-year period in the 1970s, until she was assassinated in 1984 by her Sikh bodyguards. Her bodyguards killed her because she ordered the Indian army to storm the Golden Temple near Amritsar to stop a group of armed Sikh separatists. The resulting Sikh Hindu riots resulted in the death of 3,000 people. Her son Raj Gandhi became the new prime minister. However, he was assassinated in 1991 by a Sri Lankan separatist group. Raj's Italian-born widow, Sonia Gandhi, becomes prime minister in 2004. Under Indira Gandhi and her family, India will emerge as a nuclear power in the same year when it successfully tests 5 nuclear devices. While India had developed nuclear weapons in 1974, it had not pursued developing these weapons. Soon after the 1998 test, Pakistan tested its own nuclear weapons. The potential of a Pakistani-India nuclear confrontation is one that continues to worry the world. Connected to this is the deep reality that Pakistan continues to support terrorist groups that attack India. The 2008 attacks in Mumbai by a Pakistani-supported group of terrorists resulted in more than 190 people killed and 300 wounded. the continued conflict between India and Pakistan remains a source of tension throughout the entire region. For several decades after Indian independence, India focused its economic development around the idea of using large government projects to build Indian self-sufficiency. The government organized a series of 5-year plans, note the Soviet influence on Indian economic thought, which resulted in economic growth of around 5%. This isolated economic development, coupled with a burdensome amount of government regulation of business, have resulted in economic stagnation. By the early 1990s, 3 million Indians lived in households so poor that no one could afford a wristwatch, and 30% of the population will live on less than 2 meals a day. Then, in the early 1990s, India's finance minister enacted a program to liberalize its economic policy and allow for greater global growth. Foreign companies built power plants and telephone networks. Exports doubled, and Indian GDP growth rose to 7%. In the 5 years that followed the reforms, the Indian economy grew more than it did in the 40 years before them. Unlike China, with its growth based on using its low-cost labor force to become a manufacturing hub for the world, India has benefited from using its large educated population that can speak English to make it one of the computer and communication centers of the new global economy. Some say that India seems to be on the verge of emerging as a world economic power, and may yet surpass China. Many Indian companies have become emerging global corporations based on their success in the large domestic Indian market. A good example of this is the company Tata, which makes cars for the growing population of middle-class Indians. While these are small and basic by Western standards, they are good for many developing countries, which may make Tata a global car company. In fact, in a reversal of economic imperialism, Tata now owns the famous British car company Jaguar, in which it bought from Ford. While this growth is impressive, it is unclear how well India will develop in the long run unless it is able to raise its majority of Indians out of poverty. The reality is that economic growth has not been spread evenly across India. Largely, it is the southern and western parts of the country that have had the most growth, while the north has languished. In addition, the growth widened the gap between the rich and the poor. Currently in India, roughly 300 million people, 1/3 of the population, still live on less than $1 a day. However, India has also had a large middle class, or more than 2 million, and the number of millionaires in India may be larger than the number of millionaires in the United States. India has made significant steps in dealing with the problem of large-scale poverty. In many ways, India is a model of how a diverse and democratic society can engage in economic development. This is in contrast to the authoritarian development model seen in China. Similar to China, India is faced with a growing population, and in order to have economic growth, India needs to grow its economy faster than its population. India has been able to do this over the last 50 years of independence. In fact, the rate of economic growth in India has been increasing from a rate of 4% in the 1980s to 6% in the 1990s. Similar to China, this growth is based on India becoming more interconnected with the global economy. India has focused on information technology as its link to the global economic growth. At the same time, largely because of the Green Revolution, India has become self-sufficient in food production. So while the population of India has tripled in the 50 years since independence, India's food production has kept pace. There has not been a famine in India since 1947. During this period, life expectancy in India has gone up. In 1947, life expectancy was 33 years, and by 1990, it was 61 years. However, in spite of these gains, poverty remains a problem in India. India has a mixed record in trying to deal with the problem of economic inequality. The Indian elite, English-speaking and educated in Western schools, who dominated India at the time of independence, continue to dominate Indian government and business. Part of this is due to the fact that most of the government spending on education is focused on the university level and not primary education. This has resulted in the continuing education of the elite, but the continuing impoverishment of the poor majority of Indians. The result is that India has a very large and highly educated population, but an even larger uneducated population. For example, in 1981, only 36% of the adult population was literate. This rose to 52% in 1991. Even in the late 2000s, India literacy rate for women was only 45%. So while India may graduate more than 400,000 people with degrees in technology and engineering each year, there are still a small group compared to the large population of poor and uneducated people. How India will cope with this unbalanced growth as the world's largest democracy is an open question.